Greetings my little guzzlers. We're doing some baking. In fact, this is a request. I've been asked to do a birthday cake. Well, the wife's asked me to do a birthday cake. And she asked her father, whose birthday it's going to be, what kind of birthday cake would he like? And said, we'll make you one. And he said, I want a Victoria sponge. So nothing fancy. I don't know if I'd say it's not fancy, but there you go. He wants a Victoria sponge. So we're going to have a go at making one. Now, I do believe Mary Berry would say this is where you use margarine. We're not. We're doing butter. Okay. Now, the Victoria sponge, or as it's sometimes called, the Victoria sandwich cake, is essentially 2 layers of nice airy sponge, sandwiched in between is sandwiched a layer of jam, and he wanted raspberry, so it's going to be raspberry jam, and a layer of essentially like chantilly cream, so cream whisked up with some sugar, and then a little dusting of sugar on top. So that's what we're going to attempt to make. Now, I've got already prepared my 2 tins, 8-inch tins. I've buttered them all. I put some parchment paper on the bottom and then floured the outsides. So I've got 2 of them because it's 2 layers. Okay, and now we're just going to weigh out the ingredients. Now, you can't actually weigh the ingredients out until you've got your eggs, because the way to make a Victoria sponge is you weigh your eggs, and we're using 3 eggs. You weigh your eggs in the shells, 194, and that's the magic number of how much butter, caster sugar and flour you're going to use, and we're using self-raising flour. And actually self-raising flour comes up in this a little story, okay, which I'm going to tell. Well, actually it's quite a long story and you're going to have to listen to it while we make it. So I've got my weights, so all I'm going to do now is measure out my butter, my caster sugar and my self-raising flour. I've got that all measured out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my butter into the mixer bowl, and we're going to put into that the sugar, and then there's my beating. There it is. We're just going to beat this until this has gone, guess what, nice and fluffy. Now, this is called a sponge cake. Traditionally it was called a sponge cake because the texture of the cake resembled your typical sea sponge. But actually the origins of this go back to the 15th century, and in fact something resembling a sponge-like finger goes back to the Duchy of Savoy, who basically wanted to impress the French monarch who was visiting, and he had made up, just turning it up and crack, this sort of sponge type finger which sort of resembled, you know, a large digit, if you like. Now, Savoy or something like that it was called, the pronunciation again, and it actually became very popular and was adopted. It was like a core biscuit, if you like. Now, the earliest British recipe appears in the book of 1615, The English Housewife, and in that it was called biscuit bread. Mainly because it probably didn't, it was a much more biscuity, you know, drier texture than the sponge that we know of today. So I'm just going to turn that up now, and like I say, I'm going to whip that up, whipping, until that's nice and fluffy. Now, my eggs, I'm going to want to put them in a little bowl, crack them open, and then just whisk them together a little bit. Turn that down really nice and low. And I've got my custard in. Now that's not going in there, but there's a connection. But while I tell you about that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add this egg, but what we're going to do is we're going to add it in about 3 batches. He says try not to make a mess everywhere. And we're just going to combine that on a nice slow speed. Now I might need to give that a bit of a scrape down. So what's the connection with custard? Well, so far we've talked about this sort of sponge that was more of a biscuit. So, going forward, we have to think of this stuff. An English classic, Bird's Original Custard. And as it happens, this is about Bird's custard powder. Now, here was this young lady. I'll put it there next to baking powder because that's got a connection. There was this young lady, married lady, Elizabeth Bird, and she had a dodgy constitution. Her delicate stomach couldn't cope with eggs. So, and she loved custard. Now at that time it was egg custard. But unfortunately, much as she loved her custard, didn't do her guts any good. So her husband, being the dutiful man he was, and as it happened, was a chemist who had recently set up a shop in Birmingham. He thought, I'll see if I can come up with something. It's basically an egg-free custard. So he had lots of attempts. Let's get the second lot in there. He had lots of attempts, lots of failures, but eventually he came up with a way of getting this the sort of milky the milky mix, warm milk, into a texture like custard. And he discovered that all he needed to use was corn flour. So he developed an egg-free custard powder that used cornstarch, corn flour, as a way of thickening it up and making it resemble the custard. Now, he tried it on the wife loved it, and her delicate system was fine. And she actually produced some of it for her friends, who also all said how great it all was. Just have a scrape down before I put that last bit of egg in. So he said, well, hang on, I could be onto a winner here. So he set up a company to produce his new fangled custard powder. And of course, being his name was Alfred Bird, that's essentially how it became Bird's custard. So there you go. But hang on, that really doesn't have much of a connection with sponge cake because we don't use custard. I should point out that before Elizabeth Bird had her custard, custard's been around a very long time. Custard was popular in the Middle Ages. In the 14th century, the book The Form of Curry is mentioned in there. But in there, not only do they put it in like baked pastry, but it's also listed as a binding agent for meat and fish. So custard's been around in England a long, long time. So what we're going to do is now we're just going to mix that in, and then we're going to need our flour, baking powder. So I've got here a teaspoon of baking powder. I've got my 195, I think it was, grams of self-raising flour. Self-raising flour. And I need a pinch of salt. So I'm just going to give a generous pinch of salt into there. And just put that out of the way. And what we're going to do, and that can go in there, we're now going to just sieve that lot into that mixture. Which at the moment, it doesn't look very appetising, but that will be alright once we start whipping in that flour. So, turn that down. Now, the only other ingredients we're going to want is some vanilla extract and some milk, just to get this to the right consistency. So, just going to get that out of the way, and like I say, we're just going to sieve that into there. We've mentioned how poor old Elizabeth Burt's delicate stomach means she couldn't have eggs. Well, it didn't stop there. Poor little thing. She also couldn't cope with yeast, and she was finding yeasty products difficult to digest, upsetting her delicate little guts again. So Alfred said, hang on, I solved the what's name problem, the egg problem. Let's see if I can come up with a solution to replace eggs. Right, so this wants a gentle mix. We want to try not to over mix this. So we're going to do it until basically it's all mixed in. And at this stage we're going to add a teaspoon of vanilla extract. Like I say, the milk is more just to act as something to help loosen it. And what we'll do in a minute is we'll turn the mixer off and we'll give it all a good mix by hand to make sure it's thoroughly mixed. So anyway, going back to Elizabeth's problem, Albert essentially wanted a way of getting that gas into the batter, if you like, which the yeast obviously did naturally by producing CO2 through fermentation. So what he came up with was, his solution was, he made a mixture of an alkali, bicarbonate of soda, and an acid, cream of tartar, that's a sort of powdered form, and he realised he needed some form of sort of agent to help absorb moisture. So like I say, I'm just going to give this a mix around to make sure it's got it all thoroughly mixed together. And for that, again, he used cornstarch. And he found that this mixture, then when added to the flour and that, and then you added your liquid, the acid and alkali reacted and produced the CO2. He'd invented baking powder. Alright? So, we start with the fact that he came up with a solution for custard powder, and here we have him now with the baking powder. And this revolutionised cooking, in a way, baking. He never actually took a patent out on it. So others actually did sort of make money. He still made plenty of money out of it. When he died, he was a rich man when he died. I know it's not good when you did, but there you go. But another man, Henry Jones, who was a baker from Bristol, thought, hang on, if I get my flour and I add Albert's baking powder to it, people don't have to faff around getting baking powder. And he basically invented self-raising flour. So he made quite a bit of money. Right, so this is quite a loose-ish dough. So I'm not sure I really want to put any milk into that. So we've got our oven on at 170. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer. Now you could, if you want, measure this out, or you can just do it by eye. But basically we want to evenly distribute this in the two tins. So now, using a palette knife, I'm just going to spread this out. Try and get it nice and even in that pan. It's a bit of a pain actually, because it's when I try and spread it round, it's sticking to my palette knife and not to the sides of the tin because of that nice buttery flour on the side. So Albert set up his company in 1843, so obviously we're talking Victorian time. Now in Victorian times, people were finding that evening meal was getting later and later, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and you know, they'd have breakfast and then were struggling to keep going and getting hungry. So luncheon was sort of invented, if you like. But of course, even then, you know, luncheon wasn't a particularly big do. And people were finding, again, this gap between the evening and luncheon a bit too long. So what I'm going to do now, they're going to go in that oven. I'm just going to check this up to temperature, and then we're just going to bake that for about 25 minutes. And again, we just want a cocktail stick to make sure that's, you know, not moist inside. And now I'm going to do something you shouldn't do. This is damp tea cloth, and I'm now going to take a hot thing out of the oven. Don't do that, because you can scald yourself. The heat will turn it to steam and very quickly penetrate that cloth, but because I'm only just doing it to there, I'll get away with it. Now, we're not going to turn these out. We're going to leave these in the tin for about 20 odd minutes to thoroughly cool down, and then we'll turn them out, and then we can then do our final finishing touches. So keep going back, well not keep going, but to go back to the story, here we are, poor Victorians can't cope between lunch or luncheon and evening meal. So we come for one Anna Russell, and she was the 7th Duchess of Bedford and also Queen Victoria's Lady of the Bedchamber. That's an interesting job, isn't it? Lady in the Bedchamber. Between 1837 and 1841. And basically she had an idea which completely transformed society. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, because of who she was, she had servants, even though she was effectively a servant in a way to the Queen. She had her servants. So she said, bring me a pot of tea and some cakes to my room. And she thought, there you go, just a little snack, if you like, that helped me get through until dinner time. And so this became a daily occurrence. And she started sending out invites to friends in her social circles and things like that, saying, come and try afternoon tea. Well, when she went off to London, she decided to continue this, and she'd send out little printed cards inviting people along to this social art gathering, which was made quite formal, this afternoon tea. And it soon came, everybody was doing the same thing. This is great. Little social occasion, we get something to eat, sees us through. Now, Queen Victoria also decided she quite liked this idea. Now, she notoriously had a really sweet tooth, and so she loved anything like this. And by 1855, it had become a formal occasion, partly because of Queen Victoria. So, although Queen Victoria, her table was a little bit more than just a few cakes, pride of place went to this new, light and airy sponge, perfectly risen sponge, that was a result of Alfred Bird's baking powder. And she basically had this cake all the time. After Albert died in 1861, to sort of try and help a little bit, they said, we're going to name this type of sponge after you. Hence it became the Victoria sponge. So there you go. That's the history of the Victoria sponge. Why it's called the Victoria sponge. And a lot of it is down to poor old Elizabeth Bird with a dodgy constitution. Anyway, we're going to leave these to cool and then we'll assemble our sponge. So that's them both turned out now. They're a little bit warm on the bottom, but they're okay. Now what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to use the right hand one as the top. So that one's going to go onto the plate and will be the base. And what we're going to do first off is we're going to spread. Oh, now I can't get the lid off. The hands have got a little bit buttery from that there. And what we'll do is we're going to spread a nice layer of raspberry jam over the top. Okay, I'm going to use my palette knife to spread it. Now we don't want it oozing out the sides, as it were, so just want to be careful. So I'm just going to get that jammed up. Here I've got, I think, 300 mils, and that's basically what I want. 300 mils of double cream, and then, like I said to you, all we want to do, he says not what you're looking at, is I've got 3 tablespoons of caster sugar. I'm going to put that in there, and then all we're going to do, let me just get rid of that, we're just going to whip that up. So we've got a thicker cream. You can use an electric mixer if you want to do this, but be careful you don't go too far, you'll end up with butter. So I'm just going to get this nice and thick, nice and stiff now. Let's see how it's showing from the pressure. I'm just not paying attention, got it everywhere now. So all I'm going to do now is clean up what I just spilled, and then we're going to do exactly what we did before with the jam. We're going to take that cream and we're going to spread a layer of cream on top of that jam. Now this is going to be quite a thick layer, so don't want to go too close to the edges, because when I put the top on, I don't want it all squirting down the sides. I'll add a little bit more. Now Gemma, she didn't really use jam, she used fresh strawberries, but remember I had a request for raspberry. I was debating whether to use fresh raspberries like she did, but the request was raspberry jam. So I'm getting a right mess here. So the next thing we do is I'm going to take that top, place that on there, and I'm getting a bit of leakage. But I think that will do. So final little touch. Get this out of the way. Now you could sprinkle that with some icing sugar, or you can do it, give it just that little extra sparkle with some caster sugar. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a dusting, and there you have your classic Victoria sponge. Now unfortunately, I think I said to you this was a birthday cake, so I can't taste it for you. It's going to have to stay intact till tomorrow. But there you go, the history and your classic Victoria sponge cake.